Welcome to the Law of Armed Conflict Lessons from the Middle East Conflicts. This is part of the David Menashe CLE series on the Middle East and international law. We're going to be exploring how the modern interpretation of the law of armed conflict helps or hinders Israel and Western powers in asymmetric wars against non-state actors. We will pay special attention to the defensive wars in which Israel finds itself, engaged with the terrorist organization Hamas in Gaza for well over a year, now in a ceasefire after a furious confrontation with the terrorist organization Hezbollah in Lebanon, and looking both north to a fragmented Syria and east to the persistent terrorism by Yemen's Houthis. But we will also hear more generally about the impact of international governing institutions and the shifting terminology of international law and how that is influencing or may be expected to influence efforts against terrorism more broadly. And I'd like to note that this series is co-sponsored by the Israel Law and Liberty Forum and the Center for the Middle East and International Law at George Mason University's Scalia School of Law. So the Forum is an Israeli educational initiative dedicated to enriching Israeli discourse in law and democracy by promoting conservative and classical liberal ideas within Israel's legal profession. Inviting the participation of judges, professors, and legal practitioners, the Forum supports debates, publications, and podcasts aimed at law students, practicing attorneys, and the general public. More recently, it has also turned to international programming to invite greater understanding and participation by foreign audiences, both of Israel's unique constitutional questions and on issues of international law affecting Israel. And the Center for the Middle East and International Law, where I'm currently a senior fellow, we seek to foster debate and critical engagement on international law in the Middle East, with a particular emphasis on developing voices and perspectives that have largely been excluded from the academic discussion and on challenging under-examined consensus. Few geopolitical conflicts attract as much attention as those involving Israel and its Arab neighbors, and none are as ubiquitously framed in the terminology of international law. Thus, nowhere is objective academic analysis and debate about the application of international law more essential than in the Middle East. We would also like to give a special thank you to David Menashe, our speakers, and our partners in the marketing and accreditation of this event, the Tikva Fund and the Institute for Jewish Ethics. Now I'm going to do an introduction of our first panel. And they already started chatting, so you all got a sense that apparently they may or may not grab a drink after. But our first panel is actually going to be a moderated conversation between Dr. Peter Berkowitz and Dr. Michael Doran. This panel is entitled Ethical Considerations in Asymmetric Warfare, Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon as a Case Study. And so I will start by reading introductions for each, and then we'll go from there. So Peter Berkowitz, I've known Peter for a long time. I'm so glad he's joining us today. He is the Tad and Diane Taub Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. From 2019 to 2021, he served as the director of the State Department's policy planning staff, executive secretary of the department's Commission on Unalienable Rights, and a senior advisor to the Secretary of State. Dr. Berkowitz studies and writes about, among other things, constitutional government, conservatism and progressivism, liberal education, national security and law, and Middle East politics. He is the author of Constitutional Conservatism, Liberty, Self-Government, and Political Moderation, Israel and the Struggle Over International Laws of War, Virtue and the Making of Modern Liberalism, and Nietzsche, the Ethics of an Immoralist. He has edited 7 volumes on American politics and political institutions. He is a contributor at Real Clear Politics and has written hundreds of essays, articles, and reviews on many subjects for a variety of publications, including the American Political Science Review, the Atlantic, Chronicle of Higher Education, the Claremont Review of Books, Commentary, National Review, First Things, Haaretz, New York Post. I could list them all. He actually has written as well for the Wall Street Journal, Wilson Quarterly, and the Yale Law Journal. He holds a JD and a PhD in political science from Yale University and an MA in philosophy from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a BA in English literature from Swarthmore. He is also the 2017 recipient of the Bradley Prize. Mike Doran. Dr. Doran is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute. He specializes in Middle East security issues and co-hosts the Counterbalance podcast. In the administration of President George W. Bush, Dr. Doran served in the White House as a senior director in the National Security Council, where he was responsible for helping to devise and coordinate United States strategies on a variety of Middle East issues, including Arab-Israeli relations and U.S. efforts to contain Iran in Syria. He also served in the Bush administration as a senior advisor in the State Department and a deputy assistant secretary of defense in the Pentagon. He would like you to know he's born in Kokomo, Indiana. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And he went to elementary school in Carmel outside of Indianapolis before his family moved to Fullerton, California, where he graduated from Sunny Hills High School. He received a BA from Stanford University and an MA and a PhD in Near Eastern.
You're making Peter laugh.
I know. Well, that's good. I hope I made Peter laugh. He hasn't laughed enough yet. And he received a BA from Stanford University and an MA and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. Before joining Hudson, he was a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's also held teaching positions at NYU, Princeton, and University of Central Florida. He's also written a book called Ike's Gamble, which was published by the Free Press in 2016. Frequently appears on television, and he's published extensively in foreign affairs, American Interest, Commentary, Mosaic, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and New York Times. So thank you both gentlemen for joining us today. I wanted to, kick off this panel. I know that some folks got their reading a little later, so if you are in that camp, don't worry. I'm sure that Peter and Mike will catch us up. And I think I wanted to first actually start with the with one of the topics that may be on everyone's mind. I know that both Mike and Peter have commented on this publicly extensively. But I wanted to talk about the pager operation against Hezbollah in Lebanon. So if I think that the best place to start would be to have Dr. Doran or Mike, whichever you prefer,
Mike
talk.
is fine, except Peter. Peter has to call me Your Excellency.
Okay. So Mike, I actually wanted to start off. Could you tell us a little bit about what made this pager operation so fantastic? And
Uh,
fantastic could be interpreted a lot of different ways.
yeah, it was. First of all, from a just from an operational point of view, it's not the kind of thing that actually ever happens in the real world. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you see in movies. So it was fantastic in that in that sense, and that it was almost unbelievable. It was a tremendous strategic success, tactical success for sure, but also strategic success. We now see what we didn't know at the time was it was the beginning of a real escalation by Israel, which eviscerated Hezbollah, which I think was good for Israel and good for humanity. Hezbollah being a terrorist organization. I know there was a lot of criticism um, uh, directed at the Israelis um, because there were some civilian casualties, or at least one that I remember. But I can't think in terms of laws of war. I'm not, by the way, Peter is an actual lawyer and actually knows the laws of war. I just read about it. I'm an analyst of international politics. But I think the arguments that this was an indiscriminate use of force were ludicrous. I thought it was one of the most targeted operations I've ever seen in my life. You only had a pager if you were in Hezbollah and in a combat role. The fact that the uh, Iranian ambassador to Lebanon was had his eyes damaged and lost a few digits only tells us that he's in the Quds force of the IRGC, and not that he's a civilian who was somehow caught up in this conflict. Uh, so I think it was fantastic in all senses of the word. It was good for Israel, good for humanity, absolutely within the laws of war, and the kind of thing that really takes an enormous amount of ingenuity to carry out.
And so I guess I'm going to turn to Peter now because Peter is our LOAC, our lawyer on this panel. So there was a reading that was assigned in the packet that dealt with the thesis of Michael Walzer, which he had said something along the lines of, you know, that the Israel had failed to satisfy the LOAC principle of distinction because the Hezbollah operatives were not actually at the time operating, operating military equipment, and they didn't have guns in their hands when the beepers exploded. Um, what do you make of that argument? Did you find that compelling? Why or why not?
I found it totally uncompelling. I think Mike has already stated the main points, but it's worth restating in the context of Michael Walzer's outrageous accusation in the New York Times in late September that Israel, a country that condemns terrorist attacks on its own population, had effectively behaved like a terrorist organization. First, it's noteworthy that it's Michael Walzer making those attacks. Who is Michael Walzer? He's a scholar now in his late 70s or 80s, an eminent political theorist, frequently weighs in on public matters, thought to be a man of the left, of judicious temperament, pragmatic, and yet he has embraced a perspective that is very common, uh, sad to say, when it comes to Israel, which involves weaponizing the laws of war against Israel. His main argument, as you suggest, as Mike suggested, was that the pager operation did not attack Hezbollah operatives while they were on the battlefield. It attacked them off the battlefield, and there was collateral damage. But this is no way to analyze the matter, partly because it abstracts from the real facts of Israel's fight against Hezbollah jihadists, for that matter, Hamas jihadists. First fact about them. They deliberately operate within urban areas. They station their weapons within urban areas, under urban areas. They interact with the population while they're operating. They do not distinguish themselves by dressing in uniforms. Any operation that Israel would take to defend itself against Hezbollah would typically involve much more collateral damage than was caused by the beeper operation. Those were the generally those devices, which took out, by the way, thousands of operatives, generally only blew off fingers, blinded people, or injured other delicate parts of the human anatomy. If you were 1 or 2, even 3 feet away, 2 feet away, you would not have been injured. So there was next to no collateral damage, not injury, not death, and not physical infrastructure. As Mike said, um, you it would be difficult to identify an operation against terrorists that resulted in less civilian damage. And if one of the aims of the laws of war, if not the supreme aim of the laws of war, which is to minimize civilian harm, it would be difficult to imagine a way to take out people who are devoted to your destruction, which caused less damage than did Israel's pager and walkie-talkie operation. I agree with Mike. It will go down in history as one of the great military operations.
And do you think, Peter, as a follow-up, the idea, Waltzer's argument that, you're not actively engaging in combat at the time that the beeper exploded or the pager exploded, is that even a workable metric? I know that, there may be instances in which if, a member of Hezbollah sits down to eat lunch, is he no longer engaging in military operations, and therefore is he no longer a lawful target under Waltzer's theory? This is something that I thought that it's sort of once you start engaging in this type of analysis, it seems to me that it's sort of an impossible metric to apply.
Yes, but I would emphasize this point, and Mike in a way already mentioned it. Um, if you had put explosives in their personal telephones, I think the Walzer argument would have more purchase. But these were telephones that were purchased explicitly for Hezbollah to use, for operatives of Hezbollah to use to communicate with one another. The only communications on the Hezbollah on these pagers and these walkie-talkies was dealing with Hezbollah operations. So I think there's a good argument to be had that the terrorists, the jihadists, were actually when these devices exploded, when they got a message, they were using military equipment.
Okay, fair enough. Mike, I'm going to follow up. So Walter makes another sort of argument that I thought was a bit fallacious in his op-ed, but I wanted to see what you thought of it, specifically since your focus is strategy and policy. He had this line in it, which I thought was interesting. When a government authorizes, and this was again his argument against the pager operation, and this was a critique of the Israeli government. When a government authorizes the killing of men it is directly or indirectly negotiating with, such as the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in July, we have to conclude that the government isn't committed to the negotiation success. I thought this argument was a bit ridiculous, but I wanted to see what your interpretations of it were, especially since it sort of assumes a level of good faith from Hamas leadership that I don't think is quite deserving. But I would love to see what you thought of that.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. It's I don't know if Peter, did you mention just and unjust wars?
I didn't. I only mentioned him, eminent scholar of political theory. Please discuss it.
Yeah, Michael Walzer wrote a book coming out of the debates about Vietnam called "Just and Unjust Wars," where he tackled all of these questions about the legal use of force. Um, and I read it as an undergraduate. It had a big impact on me. I found it incredibly enlightening, and I can't. I can't reconcile in my mind. It is a long time. I mean, I'm unfortunately, I hate to say it, it's over 40 years ago that I read that book. I hate to say it because I don't like to be as old as I am. I want to be young again. But that's not for this podcast or for this interview. We'll talk about my problems with aging somewhere else. But but I can't reconcile in my mind the incredibly judicious and I thought wise man who wrote Just and Unjust Wars and the argument in this op-ed. I won't speculate as to why there was such a difference, or maybe I missed something in Just and Unjust Wars. The One of the things about Hezbollah and Hamas is that they have developed a strategy that is designed to use the laws of war against the people who are actually concerned with following them. And as Peter mentioned, both Hamas and Hezbollah, they put military assets, they wage their wars behind human shields. So a democratic military puts itself between its civilians and the armed enemy. A terrorist army puts its civilians between it and the democratic army that it is attacking. And then it uses purposefully social media or media uh, to highlight the civilians who have been killed by the tactic that they're carrying out. I mean, they want a lot of their own civilians killed because it weakens their enemy who's concerned about killing civilians. That's the strategy. There's an enormous international effort right now to look past this incredibly simple and elemental aspect of the situation. The genius of the Israeli pager operation. I know you asked about Sinwar. I'll get to that in a second. But one of the things that was genius about it is that it subverted this strategy. I mean, they thought that because Hezbollah thought that because they're embedded in amongst civilians and also Hamas, that Israel can't actually get to them without killing an enormous number of civilians, which will cause a backlash in the West, and particularly in Washington, D.C., which will force the Americans then to put pressure on the Israelis to stop the war. Once the war stops, then it's a victory for Hezbollah or Hamas merely because they survived. So that strategy was subverted by the beeper operation because the Israelis found a way to actually observe the laws of war in an incredibly strict manner and deliver a devastating blow. It's one of the things that I found particularly elegant and beautiful about the operation. And I have no difficulty saying elegant and beautiful. I really thought it was all of those things. With regard to Sinwar, I mean, the idea that because they were negotiating, what choice do they have but to negotiate with him? He's holding hostages. He's holding hostages in extremely cruel circumstances. He's not allowing them to be visited by the Red Cross, whereas the international community is insisting that the Israelis allow the Red Cross or Red Crescent to visit the prisoners that Israel has taken in the war. So the question really is, are we, and when I say we, the West, are we going to allow the laws of war that we developed to try to minimize civilian deaths to be used against us so that by terrorists, so the terrorists can win wars? I think we have to say no. We're not going to allow that to happen. No one, anyone who's read any history, knows that countries negotiate and fight simultaneously. That's just there's no war in. I'm gonna go out on a limb. I have not studied every war, but I think you're going to be hard pressed to find a war in which military action and negotiation hasn't proceeded simultaneously. So it's an absurd argument, actually, and it pains me to say it, as I said, because that book, Just and Unjust Wars, is, if I had to name, the 100 books I've read that I thought were indispensable, that would certainly be on my list.
Yeah, I think he published it in the 70s. Is that right?
Yeah,
He published
that's
it.
right.
It's an older. So I
Yeah.
know that we in the second half of this session, Jeremy Radkin will be speaking, and I think in one of his papers he cites it quite heavily. So it's had a lasting impact in academic discussions of LOAC. But to Peter's point, I think Walter's arguments are not that impressive.
I mean,
Um,
Peter, sorry to interrupt, but Peter will know better than I because I'm not in this field. I mean, I just have read a few books. But Peter, isn't it considered the classic in the field? Is there anything that's so
It,
more canonical?
over the last 50 years, it has no rivals. Yeah, you're right. And Eric, could I just amplify a point that Mike made? Um, it's not just that Sinwar, and by the way, Hania, who it is thought the Israelis took out in Tehran guest house for the RGC. It's not just that they're holding hostages. What does it mean to keep faith with the mastermind of a massacre of civilians, which took place on October 7th? There's a,
Great
there's
point.
another, there's another point we need to emphasize, and this is just amplifying a point Mike made. Everything about Hamas's attacks on Israel, its strategy, its planning, its warfare is a violation of the international laws of war, the law of armed conflict. On October 7th, they attacked Israeli civilians, civilian populations, and infrastructure. Manifest, blatant violation of the laws of war. They kidnapped civilians. Contrary to the laws of war, they haven't allowed Red Cross or anybody else to see the civilians. Manifest violation of the laws of war. They built hundreds of miles of tunnels under Gaza to operating under civilian areas. They operate in and around houses, schools, mosques, United Nations facilities for the reasons Mike mentioned, both to inhibit Israeli counterattacks and also they want uh, Palestinian civilian deaths because they know that harms Israel's image in the court of international public opinion and in international organizations, ICJ, ICC. But all of this, every single aspect of it is contrary to the laws of armed conflict. So I think what we should be saying is that the tragic carnage, the tragic loss of life, injury, devastating damage to physical infrastructure in Gaza, we should say plainly that that is presumptively the moral and legal responsibility of Hamas. So taking out those people in the process of negotiations, just as Mike said, is a part of warfare.
And so I guess this is we also so in the readings we had one of the articles by Jeff Korn, and he goes into a tremendous amount of detail, his main thesis being that you can make a distinction between human shielding, which I think is what both you and Mike were discussing, and the idea of intentionally seeking the death of your own civilians through goading the other side to attack. You actually seek the death of your civilians, not just by hiding behind them, but by hoping and encouraging the other side to attack your civilians. Now, I think it's an interesting distinction to make in the context of Gaza in particular. But I want to ask, do you think it's possible to make that distinction? Like, can we really tell the difference between human shielding and intentionally seeking the death of your own civilians? Is that sort of a distinction without a difference, Peter?
From a legal point of view, they're both blatant violations of the laws of war. You could say the second is more serious. Human shielding could merely mean seeking to inhibit the enemy from attacking. That, by the way, is a violation of the laws of war. But then hoping the enemy will attack in the expectation that your own dead non-combatants will serve to produce denunciations of the enemy, in this case Israel, at the ICJ, the ICC, and in respected diplomatic conversations in the so-called international community. It seems to me that's a magnification of the initial crime, but we should be clear, the initial crime is the use of human shields. There's no justification for that under the international laws of war.
And I guess this is a question for both of you. And since there is no justification for it, why do we think that it's been such, and this actually I'll ask this directly to you, Mike. Why do you think that human shielding has been a concept that has been so heavily ignored by humanitarian organizations? So we see reports from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that I think have fallen far askew from what their stated or ostensible mission is supposed to be. But why is it that this human shielding, which Peter just said is so clearly in violation of LOAC, why is it not something that gets more coverage from these groups? Why are these groups not pressuring Hamas to both, not use their own civilians as human shields, but also not to use hostages as human shields?
There's an incredible bias. It's always existed, but it really has become much more pronounced since October 7th against Israel in international organizations, um, and in the West. The it's always been there since 1948. There's been a sense that Israel is powerful and dynamic, and growing, and that the conflict with the Palestinians is unfair because of that, and that the international community, for lack of a better word, needs to counterbalance the power of the Israelis on behalf of the Palestinians. There's no you can see it really clearly. You can see it really clearly in the policies of the Biden administration. The Biden administration, I'm sure you have to sort of have experience in talking to these people to see it. They don't make it clear in their public statements, but um, I think it's pretty obvious that the moment the war broke out on October 7th, the Biden administration sat down at the highest levels and they defined two war aims uh, for the United States. One war aim was to preserve the outreach to Iran that was the centerpiece of the Biden Middle East policy. And you could see immediately there was a distinction made. And when I say immediately, on October 7th, I followed the public statements very clearly. And the senior official was asked about the Iranian role.
Hmm.
And they said they said, and this was followed up a couple days later by Antony Blinken, that that the Iranians had no um, knowledge of the timing or the scope of the operation. So the Iranians had armed, trained, and equipped Hamas. They had been planning together with Hamas and Hezbollah for. We now know from captured documents that the documents that the Israelis captured in Gaza. We now know that all elements of the what Iran calls its resistance axis were planning a major joint operation, but Hamas jumped the gun on them and started it when they weren't ready. And the United States U.S. intelligence understood that the Iranians were surprised by the timing of the attack, and so they used that immediately. They started making this statement in order to distance Iran from the event. So it's like I contract you, Erielle, to kill Peter, and I train you on the weapons to do it, and I tell you I help you understand how to break into his house to shoot him. But I make sure that I'm on an airplane flying to Miami at the time that you do the killing, and then when it comes to trial and people find out that I contracted you and I trained you, my defense says, but Mike didn't know anything about the timing, and he didn't know, that you were going to also kill his dog, kill Peter's dog, and mutilate his body or something. It's a strange distinction, but this shows how much they wanted to preserve the outreach to Iran, distance Iran from the event, so that efforts to work with Iran to calm down the regional situation were still legitimate. The second thing that I think the historians will discover when they see the documents is that the second American goal was to make sure that the Israeli right wing did not benefit from this war. They immediately came out, or not immediately, but a couple of weeks after the event, they started demanding that Prime Minister Netanyahu accept a revitalized Palestinian Authority. Revitalized Palestinian Authority has to be responsible for Gaza. The United States never defined the destruction of Hamas as a goal. Occasionally they make references to it, but that's not a war goal. And it's not a war goal because the U.S., we now know, strongly advised the Israelis not to go in on the ground in Gaza, not to go into Gaza City, not to go into Khan Yunis, not to go into Rafah. By the time it came down to Rafah, they were making it the Americans were making their opposition very, very, very public. If you go back and you look at the Obama administration and the Kerry plan to bring peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, Abu Mazen never answered. Kerry made some proposals and developed some ideas about how to solve the conflict. Abu Mazen never answered him. The Israelis came up with an answer. Abu Mazen did not. The administration left as it was leaving office. It orchestrated, pretending that it didn't, but it orchestrated UN Resolution 2334, which designates everything which designates the green line. Those are the 1949 armistice lines between Jordan and Israel, which were the pre-June War, 1967 lines between Jordan and Israel. It basically defines that as an international boundary and says that any building that the Israelis have done on the other side of the Green Line, which means East Jerusalem, right, neighborhoods that every Israeli today regards part of Israel proper.
The
Um,
entirety of the old city,
the entirety of the old city, the
the Jewish
Western
quarter.
Wall. This is all occupied. This is all illegal settlement by Israel, right? Because what is happening there is that this is the American government. Again, they orchestrated it. The Americans abstained. The Obama administration abstained from this resolution, but they're the ones who put it all together
Hmm.
because they're trying to build up a body of law and a body of international opinion and an international coalition that will impose a two-state settlement on the Israelis instead of having one negotiated directly between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to develop. I know I've gone on here at quite some length, but I'm developing the notion that deeply embedded in the West, including in the United States national security apparatus. There's this sense that the West has to intervene on behalf of the Palestinians, precisely because the Palestinian leadership, whether in the form of the Palestinian Authority, Abu Mazen, or in the form of Hamas, is so dysfunctional and incapable of putting forth the case for a two-state solution that the West wants it to put forward. Like
Hmm.
the West keeps handing a script, and it hands the international law to the Palestinians and saying, "Here's the pathway, please take it." They reject it, and when they reject it, the West comes in to take further actions against Israel. So as a result of this, there has developed a kind of sense that the problematic actor is Israel. The actor that has to be blocked is Israel because it is so much more powerful than the Palestinians. I think, um, a perverse approach to solving this conflict. It infantilizes the Palestinian leadership. It doesn't hold them responsible for its own mistakes and its own crimes, and it incentivizes them to be intransigent and to never accept any compromise because they know the West is always going to step in there for them. Sorry, I went on and on about this. That's before we even get to the question of anti-Semitism, which I avoided and just talked about it in terms of. But I think it's there. I think there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the world as well.
So I guess to summarize some of it too would be that there isn't, I was discussing a lot of the wayward shift of these international humanitarian law organizations. But I guess what you're also suggesting is that there isn't a ton of daylight between the agenda that's being perhaps pursued by HRW or Human Rights Watch, excuse me, Amnesty International, and sort of individuals who might be entrenched within the national security apparatus. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like there's,
Can
obviously
I?
they have a much more aggressive, the humanitarian organizations have a much more aggressive agenda, but it seems like to your point, there is a bit of um, infantilizing or at least ignoring to a very heavy degree the actions taken by the leadership of both Hamas and I would say the PA as well in certain
Yeah,
instances.
can I talk a little bit more? I feel like I have I'm going to put Peter to sleep here by this long soliloquy, but Peter, with your permission, just a few more words.
Please.
The um what the administration did, the Biden administration did, is and this is a strategy. It knows exactly what it's doing. There's a kind of um, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde quality to the policy on even sometimes in the same sentence they say Israel has a right to defend itself,
But
but Israel's murdering too many civilians, right? And they go back and forth with this all the time. they're very much aware that when they testify uh, in a variety of ways to the murdering of civilians or the failure to provide humanitarian support and so on, that they are empowering the ICC, the ICJ, all of this sort of thing. They want to do that.
Hmm.
They want to do that. Because for the reasons I said, they want to build up this body of this body of international opinion as a counterweight to Israel.
Hmm.
At the same time, they have to answer to their American electorate, which doesn't buy that by and large. I mean, there's a segment of the progressive base that is marching in lockstep with those international organizations that are hostile to Israel and turn a blind eye um, to the to the violations of international law by Hamas and other Palestinian organizations. But there's also a body of opinion in the Democratic base that doesn't accept that, and so this allows the Biden administration to have it both ways. They can empower the anti-Israel elements, or let's call them anti-Israel elements. That's what they are. They can empower the anti-Israel elements while also showing themselves to be different from the anti-Israel elements, or to be restraining the anti-Israel elements. I wrote an article um, called, I think it's called the Anti-Israel Sanctions Machine for Tablet Magazine. This is the first administration that has set up a machine, an interagency machine, whose goal is to issue sanctions against Israel. Now,
Hmm.
some of them, which they have proposed, which the interagency machine has proposed, like for example, sanctions on Minister Ben-Gvir, the Minister for National Security, the President Biden has nixed. So the proposal has come to him, and he's decided not to do it. But the administration makes sure to publicize the fact. It leaks to Barack Ravid that Biden was considering these sanctions against Ben-Gvir, but didn't do it. And then what happens is it looks like the bureaucracy from down below is urging Biden to take this step, but Biden steps in. Biden, the Zionist, the friend of Israel, steps in and says, "No, I won't do that." But he's the one who created the machine that's making these proposals. Part of the job of the machine is to make proposals that he will nix so that he can look like he's not the guy who created the machine.
So I
But
want
he
to, so, oh,
but he can
sorry, go
still get
ahead.
all sorry, it's but he can still get the informational effect. I will stop here. I know I've gone on and
No,
on.
no, it's okay. I have actually a few questions for Peter that jump off to what you just said. Peter, so going off of what Mike was just discussing, which is basically, there's been hints or possible considerations of targeting Israeli leaders from the US government, but we've actually seen that Israeli leadership has been targeted in terms of the recent arrest warrants that came out of the ICC. And I thought this might be, since we are doing a CLE, on not just the law of armed conflict, but perhaps its incorrect interpretations, it might be a good opportunity to talk a little bit about the recent arrest warrants that came down from the ICC. I think a good place to start would be, for those who are not aware or are less aware, um, Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, as well as the former Minister of Defense Gallant, they were accused of, quote, using starvation as a method of warfare. Um, Peter, what is the basis of this accusation?
I have no idea the basis of their accusation. They provided no evidence to support it. And here's something crucial. In order to determine whether the deprivations that the Palestinians undoubtedly suffered in Gaza, you would at minimum have to look at Israel's rules of engagement. What did the command structure direct the IDF to do in Gaza in this operation or that operation? As far as I know, the judges at the ICC have no access to Israel's rules of engagement. That in itself, I believe, renders null and void any judgment they might the particular judgment that they came to, that is to issue the arrest warrants. Moreover, we know that that enough enough humanitarian aid has been introduced into Gaza to feed all of the residents. What happened to that food, that humanitarian aid? It's been stolen by Hamas. Um, None of this enters into the judge's assessments that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant are guilty of war crimes. By the way, starvation is just one of the war crimes. They are also accused of murder, of targeting civilians. These accusations, or these judgments, couldn't possibly have been reasonably made based upon the evidentiary record before them. So I would regard these judgments as an outrage against the laws of war, because of course the laws of armed conflict are are quite clear that a nation, a party, is allowed to take the steps necessary to defend itself um, against an enemy. Israel has been compelled, its very existence, to take the fight to Hamas and Hezbollah as well. So there's no question that uh, Israel's announced military objective in Gaza, which was to destroy Hamas's ability to uh, to operate as a military and to govern Gaza. There's little question that that's a legitimate military objective, because Hamas has decided to interweave itself into civilian life in Gaza. There's no question that there would be incidental, that is, unintended damage by Israel to physical infrastructure, incidental death and injury. It turns out it's massive because of Hamas's deliberate decision about how to conduct the war.
And so it's interesting because there are instances in which, for under the law of sieges, right, it is lawful, starvation may be incidental under the law of sieges if you are concerned that food going in or aid going into the territory that you are sieging will be taken by the enemy forces. You actually are allowed to engage in a siege. And so starvation in that case may be incidental. I'm not saying that that's necessarily something that you don't want that to happen, obviously. But under international law, that's how international law has understood incidental occurrences that unfortunately do happen. The same thing for the civilian deaths. The IDF takes extraordinary precautions to make sure that there aren't, to make sure that it can mitigate civilian deaths as much as possible. And sometimes when you operate in an urban setting, it's unavoidable. What I want to ask you though is that the removal of the term incidental, or the removal, the idea that is if something happens, then it must have been intentional. That in and of itself seems very damaging to the institution of LOAC. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with it, and this is the way I've come to think about it. Actually, I think about it in terms of the great Jewish sage Hillel. Hillel said, what was once challenged to summarize all of Torah standing on one foot. And he said, what is hateful to you, don't do it unto others. All the rest is interpretation. Go and study. I'm going to give those who've joined in this seminar something similar about the laws of war. You can summarize the laws of war standing on one foot. Balance military necessity with humanitarian responsibility. All the rest is interpretation. Go and study. Here's the problem with the people who denounce Israel, accuse it of war crimes, crimes against humanity. We haven't talking about the very common charge of genocide against Israel. A State Department official in October of 2023, Israel had barely begun its ground operation, accused Israel of committing genocide. The problem with the State Department sometimes, with the ICC, the ICJ, and many people who almost reflexively accuse Israel of war crimes is they don't take the balancing test at the heart of the laws of armed conflict seriously. That is, they know humanitarian responsibility. Perhaps they're familiar with human rights law, but they know nothing about military necessity. They don't take seriously the threats Israel faces. They don't take seriously the battlefield Israel confronts. They don't take seriously the jihadists' military strategy and tactics. They don't take seriously the logistic challenges that Israel faces. But that means that they are disqualified from even applying the central test. I mean, we can speak about, and Jeremy Rabkin and others will speak, no doubt, about the principle of necessity, the principle of distinction, principle of proportionality. But again, all of these, at the end of the day, mean balanced military necessity and humanitarian responsibility. If you don't study war, you are in no position to make judgments about whether the laws of war have been honored. And I'm sorry to say that it appears to me that the judges of the ICC, the judges of the ICJ, some officials in the State Department, and many of Israel's accusers around the world are disqualified from rendering judgments about whether Israel's honored the laws of war because they simply do not take seriously the imperatives of military necessity that Israel faces.
And do you think that this rhetoric, so we're seeing this rhetoric right now directed at Israel, but it seems to me, and it's sort of manifested or culminated, I believe, in the ICC warrants, arrest warrants. Do you think, Peter, that there is a real risk to, perhaps the United States being targeted by the ICC for its conduct in Afghanistan or Iraq? I know that back in 2021, when there were murmurs of possibly opening an investigation into Israel's conduct in the 2021 Gaza war, it was sort of accompanied by potential questions about United States conduct in Afghanistan. So I'm wondering if you think that what the ICC's sort of bastardization, for lack of a better term, or degradation of LOAC poses risk to the United States as well.
It poses a huge risk to the United States. There are no two militaries, I should say, militaries of rights-protecting democracies in the world that are more dependent for their national interest than than the countries of Israel and the United States. These two rights-protecting democracies are more dependent on their militaries than any other rights-protecting democracies. Um, a, the practice of politicizing the laws of war to attack Israel is detrimental to the United States, not just because it harms a friend and partner of the United States in the Middle East, not only because that friend and partner is a rights protecting democracy, but because these doctrines, these judgments, this reckless suppression of questions of military necessity, for sure, will come back, do come back, have come back to haunt the United States. All friends of the rule of law should be opposed to the weaponization of the rule of law into the laws of armed conflict against Israel.
And I should have added probably the West as a whole,
Yeah,
because I
yeah.
think that your discussion of the inability for members of the State Department, but also those in the ICC and others at humanitarian organizations to consider the question of balancing, right? That poses a risk to, I'd say any sort of Western army that's fighting a non-state force, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's the Houthis. I think that, you would probably agree with me when I say that I think it's going to be a long-term problem when dealing with non-state actors.
Not going to be. It has been for a long time. And Mike is absolutely right when he asserts that Hamas, Hezbollah, the Islamic Republic of Iran, they understand that rights protecting democracies like Israel and the United States train their troops, train their officers in the laws of war. They have judiciaries. We have judiciaries. The Israel has a judiciary that hears allegations of war crimes. We have what has been called in the circles from which Michael Walzer comes a universal benevolent conscience that inhibits us. It's part of their strategy to use our laws of wars against us. And in my judgment, it's a disgrace that we have so many people ostensibly on our side who are only too willing to play into the hands of the jihadists and pervert the laws of war to inhibit Israel and the United States from defending themselves as you said, Ariel, as we do actually abide by the laws of war. And one more point,
Yeah,
if I may, to
absolutely.
borrow,
And then I'm going to open it up for questions to the audience. So if you are in the audience and you have a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A as Peter finishes his last point.
yeah, and Mike said this in a different context. It's worth emphasizing to paraphrase from a Justice of the United States Supreme Court in a different context. The laws of war are not a suicide pact. The laws of war, as I said, they say balance between military necessity and humanitarian responsibility. They authorize um, nations, countries to use all the necessary force to defend themselves, to accomplish legitimate military objectives. And we should never lose sight of this. In our tradition, what is the first of human rights, or what is the first of our unalienable rights? Life, self-defense. So any interpretation of the laws of war that that would criminalize a country's exercise of its right of self-defense, as which seems to be the efforts of many people in international organizations when it comes to Israel, should be resisted not only as contrary to Israel's interests and America's interests, but actually contrary to the principles on which the laws of war are founded.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you both. This was a very interesting conversation. I would like to open it up for questions if anyone in the audience does have questions. There is the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So I actually, okay, so we have our first question, and feel free to add in more. This is from, I won't say the name of the guest. I'll keep it anonymous unless you prefer not to be. But the first question I have for you, and I guess let me just take a quick read of it first before I can figure out, okay. Um, okay, so I guess I will start with actually Peter and Mike. You can both chime in on this. The accusation against Israel of genocide, quote unquote, is, as the speakers have said, obviously false, but it is widely accepted and the result is dangerous to Israel. A majority of congressional Democrats now want the U.S. to stop selling arms to Israel. What can Israel do to effectively rebut that accusation? I'll start with you, Peter, and then I'll go to Mike.
Well, effectively is a big challenge because there are massive forces around the world who support the charge of genocide. But the first step we can take is to speak clearly about the matter. First of all, what is genocide? Genocide is the intentional effort to wipe out a people in whole or in part. It is ludicrous to apply this to Israel's war efforts in Gaza. Israel has um, the the proportion of non-combatants that have died in Israel's efforts to destroy Hamas as a fighting force are lower than any similar conflict by a democracy fighting terrorist organization. Uh, there is nobody has provided any showing of an effort by Israel. Indeed, Israel has the military capability to flatten Gaza in a morning, maybe an entire day. Israel, as you, Ariel, have said, has taken extraordinary precautions. The death and destruction is, as a moral and legal matter, as I've already said, on Hamas's shoulders. So the first thing we can do is explain this. I regret to say that the Biden administration and the Biden administration's State Department has done a terrible job of explaining this to the American public. We've done a terrible job at the United Nations in explaining this. The points that I'm making are not complicated points. They're not sophisticated points. One doesn't have to have spent 3 years in law school to make them. Our diplomats ought to be capable of making these arguments. They've failed. So what can the United States do? The government can explain this much better to the American people, and um, I hope in the coming months we will have a government that does explain these matters much better, much more effectively to the American people.
And it's also, to your point, Peter, it's a disservice to instances in which genocide may be occurring. For instance, there was the mass grave of, over 100,000 individuals discovered in Syria. There are instances in which genocide may actually be appropriate, and yet it's the term itself is becoming cheapened.
So if you're right, and if I may make even more precise your point, genocide now means more deaths in a conflict than you think appropriate.
Hmm.
It has lost every other meeting. The State Department official that I referred to last October, uh, at which point Israel had barely begun its ground operation, accused Israel of genocide and accused Joe Biden of complicity in genocide. Under the formal legal definition, or in comparison to the enormities that we associate with genocide, um, most paradigmatically, the Holocaust, it is, as you say, it is an obscenity to compare Israel's military operation to genocide. But of course, the other side has a rhetorical trick in mind. They ex they very much want the world community to see the Jews who have been the victims of genocide as now perpetrators of genocide. This is part of the dastardly lawfare that you're using. Explaining the meaning of genocide, explaining the facts, is one crucial action that we need to engage in to counter this outrageous accusation.
Thank you, Peter. Mike, I actually have a different question for you since that answer was quite comprehensive. Thank you. I'd love to hear if you, and this is from the audience, could you comment at all on the barriers to treating the Palestinians with moral agency? So we know that there is the pay for slay program, which if for those who are unfamiliar, it's a system that is carried out by the Palestinian Authority, where effectively, if you are a quote unquote martyr that engages in a terror attack and you kill a certain number of Jewish individuals, if you die in the attack, your family will receive a pension. If you survive, you also will receive some sort of pension from the Palestinian Authority. So they have the system of pay for slay. And then in Gaza, you also have obviously the election of Hamas, and then just avoiding general duties under the Oslo Accords. So what are the barriers? Again, I'll go to the initial part of the question. What are the barriers to treating the Palestinians with moral agency in those instances?
I think the number one barrier is what I mentioned before, is that uh, there's this deep-seated belief in the West, and it's ensconced in every foreign ministry in the West, basically almost without exception, that it's the job of the West to counterbalance the power of Israel. If you, I, I've had a lot of experience. We're inside of government and outside of government, talking to Western diplomats about the Palestinian Authority and about Hamas, and they'll all admit to dysfunctionality or worse. But then they add, but that's why we have to X, Y, and Z. It's a remarkable thing. I can't think of another case like this, where there's such a consensus about the role of the West is to constrain the power of a Western ally. There may be another one out there. I never thought of but to try to examine it, but it really is a special case. In the United States itself, uh, the Palestine question has always been, well, the question of Zionism has always been one on the at the on a central cultural divide in our society. And this is more than just a political divide. I mean, you can see it now very clearly in the politics when Donald Trump says, "I'm going to move the embassy to Jerusalem," and his Secretary of State tells him, "If you do that, there will be uprisings against the United States across the Arab world. Americans will die if you do that." And at the same time, a very significant portion of the American people are in favor of this step. Obviously, the group that is most in favor of this step are the evangelical Christians.
Mhm.
And I think this divide between Fox News and the universities, between evangelical Christians and the progressives and so on. It's a political divide, but it's also a really, really deep cultural divide. And when in our society, when you take a position against Zionism, you're taking a position not just against Israel, but against deep currents of opinion in the United States about the United States. And I think there's a similar phenomenon in Western Europe as well. Not identical, but similar. Because of the connection between Zionism and the Bible, the issue of Israel touches on the deepest roots of Western identity and the identity of Western nations. And Israel is, among other things, a symbol in our cultures. And this is a highly complex issue, and it has different roots in different countries, but the roots are deep everywhere. Israel is a symbol for national sovereignty. Israel is a symbol for belief in God. I mean, the simplest thing to do with Americans is say, do you believe in God? Does God play a role in your life? It's almost guaranteed that for those people who say God plays a role in their life, that they're going to be pro-Israel. For those who say God it doesn't play a role in their life, well, maybe yes, maybe no. So all of these things make this issue, I think, much more complex, much more a part of our religious culture, much more a part of our our popular culture than any other international issue I can think of. You know, I'll give you one last thought about this. When I was a part of a team to help uh, Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin when he ran for the presidency in 2016. There was a little team to advise him on international politics. And I went out to Wisconsin to meet with him with a few other people. And we started talking about some of the big international issues, and he needed to formulate his conception on these issues. And the minute we started in the Middle East, and we got to Israel, he said, "No, I don't need any help with Israel. I've already got my position on Israel." So he had not formulated any other major foreign policy position, but he had a position on Israel. Because to be a politician in the United States, you have to have a position on Israel before you even ever talk about foreign policy. It's part of our domestic politics. So I think that starts to explain why we find this real complex of attitudes toward Israel and sense of duty in the West to restrain Israel or to support it that has nothing to do with what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah.
Sorry, I kept saying one last time. One last point. When I started in this business, the argument was that we had to restrain Israel because if we didn't, we would lose our Arab allies as allies. So that if we got too close to Israel, we would drive the Arabs away from us. And then during the Obama administration, we saw that actually Arab countries wanted to get closer to Israel. And the strategic argument for restraining Israel, which I had always thought was the reason we were restraining Israel, because it was
Right.
a misguided strategic belief. What happened? They changed the strategic argument. One, they
Right.
turn it into just a moral argument. We have to save Israel from itself. If we don't restrain Israel, Israeli democracy will disappear. Or, no, we have to restrain Israel because of Iran. But
Right.
it's no longer that we're going to drive all of the Arabs away from the United States. So what you learn from this, and I'll stop here, is that the strategic argument is actually downstream from the cultural argument. But the people making the strategic argument don't actually feel that.
Okay. That's interesting, and it's also one of those it's one of those things where it's the I guess the term would be shifting goalposts. But it seems to me that I think the Abraham Accords indicated that that thesis did not carry much weight.
You
On
remember,
the,
I'm sorry, I keep jumping in here, but you remember the four no's of John Kerry
yeah,
on the Abraham Accord. No, 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 no. Yeah, because Benjamin Netanyahu basically was what he said says that we can go broker peace agreements between Arab states and Israel without getting a Palestinian state first. No, 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 no. That will never happen.
no, and it did happen.
Yeah.
And may potentially continue once the next Trump administration comes to power. I wanted to thank you both for your time. This has been incredibly informative. I hope it's been informative for the audience as well.